Hi, I'm Debbie Marshall, the minister here at St. Andrew's United Church. Today we're having a panel on the fentanyl and opioid crisis here in Nanaimo. We've had the pleasure to have Michelle Latour from AIDS Vancouver Island, who's going to speak and answer questions about the issue.
So I'll talk to you a little bit about fentanyl and the crisis that we find ourselves in. I don't really like to use the word crisis when we're talking about the current situation that's going on, just because what's happening has been happening for quite a while. Fentanyl isn't really a new substance to BC. What's going on right now is, of course, particularly bad. The amount of overdoses and deaths in Nanaimo and Vancouver Island in BC were really bad last year and the year before, and already sort of in January and February, but it has been coming for quite a while. The implementation of the naloxone program, which I'll talk a little bit about in a while, definitely helped. It started in, I think, 2011. And that's been a really big help for us as service providers, but also for our clients. And you'll see a lot of these around town. We sort of are doing as many trainings as possible. And I'll definitely encourage you to come by and get a training from us. I carry one of these around in my purse at all times, even when I'm at home, just because at any point you might need to use it. So I'll talk a little bit about the opiate climate. I was talking to one of your congregants a little bit earlier just about the opiate climate in Canada. Something that I've learned from talking to people across the country, even I have a family member who lives in Halifax, is that fentanyl is mainly here in BC. There's a little bit of it happening in Alberta, but it's not happening in, say, Halifax. It's not anywhere sort of out east in the same way that it's happening in BC. There's a lot of speculation around that. It could be mainly that we're sort of a big port for drugs. We have the downtown east side, which is the poorest zip code in Canada. And we do have a lot of ports, right? So we have drugs coming into Victoria and Nanaimo and Vancouver. And to give you a little bit of, to help you understand a little bit why fentanyl is so popular, fentanyl is about 100 times stronger than heroin, which means that it's a lot cheaper to ship. So instead of sending something about this much weight, you can actually fit about that much potency into a golf ball. So that's one of the reasons that fentanyl has become such a big deal here, is that it's a lot cheaper to ship, it's a lot cheaper to actually make and to put into things. And one of the really big dangerous things about fentanyl is how it distributes. So I watched a documentary on it a little while ago, and what they did is they dyed fentanyl pink and then they pressed it into pills, and some of the pills were almost completely pink, and then some of them only had a couple speckles of pink, which gives you an idea of exactly how much fentanyl you can or can't expect in any given dosage. So people who are using fentanyl actually have no idea at any point how much they're using. And the really dangerous thing right now that we're finding is that fentanyl is showing up in everything. Fentanyl is showing up in heroin, obviously. I don't know a lot of people who are actually able to get just heroin nowadays. It's showing up in every other drug class. It's also showing up in marijuana, which for a lot of people that I know is very concerning. This is the West Coast, it's BC, so a lot of people partake in marijuana, and it's showing up in that. And it's really dangerous because fentanyl is highly addictive, it's highly dangerous, and it's showing up just about everywhere. And there's really no stopping the amount that's showing up. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had carfentanil actually hit Nanaimo. And carfentanil is an analog, which means it's sort of like a designer drug of fentanyl. And that is 100 times more potent than fentanyl, and it's actually an elephant tranquilizer. So that has shown up. Try not to scare you guys, but you did ask me to come and talk about it. So carfentanil is now in Nanaimo. So To give some scale, the idea is that the amount of about a grain of sugar of fentanyl is enough to get somebody high, and 2 could be enough to cause an overdose. And if we're talking about carfentanil, it's about 1 grain of sand and 2 grains of sand for the same scale. So that's sort of what the climate is like right now. It's really dangerous. So we're talking about naloxone, and maybe I'll talk about naloxone for a little while, because I feel like I'm starting to ramble and I think I need to bring my thoughts in a little bit. Naloxone, or Narcan, you've maybe heard of Narcan. 1 second. So this is a naloxone kit. And I wish I had remembered to bring a mock kit, but this is my actual kit, so just bear with me. A naloxone kit is actually designed to help reverse an overdose, and the naloxone can only reverse an opiate overdose. So this is going to help with heroin, fentanyl, carfentanil, oxycontin, morphine, methadone. It's not going to help with something like cocaine. It's not going to help with alcohol or speed. It's just for opiates. But considering that's what we're really having problems with right now, it's great. A lot of people complain that we don't have other tools to help with other drugs. And I say, at least we have this. It's been hugely helpful. The stat for last year was that there were over 16,000, almost 17,000 kits dispensed, which I believe, because we hand these out at least 10 a day right now. And that's just us, just one agency in Nanaimo. So the way that you use it is if somebody is having an overdose, maybe I'll go over the signs of what an overdose looks like. I'll obviously encourage you to come down and see me or some of my coworkers or even Sandy at Harris House to do a proper training. An opiate overdose is pretty hard to miss. It looks sort of unlike anything else. A person who's overdosing on an opiate or fentanyl, more specifically, since that's what we're talking about, they are going to lose consciousness. They're going to do sort of a nod, which is when they can't really keep their head up, their eyes are going to be closing, they're having a hard time keeping conscious. Their lips are going to start to go blue, they're going to start to sort of go gray, fingernails are going to go blue and purple. It's because they're not getting enough oxygen, okay? The breathing is going to start to sound really heavy and uncomfortable, almost like sleep apnea. Deep breathing, uncomfortably deep breathing, and slow breaths, so not enough breathing, and their heart rate is going to slow down. And once they fall asleep, you're going to have a hard time waking them back up. Okay? So really it's just that they're down for the count, you can't wake them up, and you're going to be able to tell, it's going to look like somebody who doesn't have enough oxygen, which is really the case. And so you see somebody who's down like that, it's a good idea to call 911. It might also look like somebody who's choked, although if somebody's choked, obviously they're not going to be able to get the oxygen in. It actually will block it for about 30 minutes, and so you've still got the opiate in your system, but it's not connecting where it wants to. What that does mean is that after about that 30 minutes, it is going to reconnect, and you can and will continue to overdose. Those 30 minutes, though, gives you time for a paramedic to get there, for the proper medical officials to save a life. So in these kits, we actually give you 3 doses. That will probably go up now that we have carfentanil in the streets. We used to have 2, and we had to go up a dose once we started having fentanyl. 3 isn't enough to bring somebody fully out of an overdose for a sustained amount of time. Sometimes you have somebody with 1 dose and it takes 30 seconds and they wake up. Sometimes it takes 5 minutes. Sometimes you have to give them all 3 doses. For fentanyl, a lot of people say that it might take up to 8 doses to fully bring them out of the overdose and not have them go back to sleep. They're saying with carfentanil, it could take anywhere from 10 to 20, which is why you have to call an ambulance. Since we can only give you 3, safely, you should not be injecting somebody more than 3 anyways. It really has to be done by a paramedic. There don't seem to be any side effects from this amount, but if you're going to be giving people more than that, it really needs to be done by a paramedic. These are intramuscular shots. Thankfully, the last thing anybody needs is to be looking for a vein when they're trying to save somebody's life. So it goes into the arm, into the thigh, or into the backside. Depending on who you're talking to, they all have different opinions. I think the thigh is really great because it's always available, right? Depending on where they're lying down, you can always get access to a thigh. It also depends on clothing. So right now, I'm only wearing one layer over my arm, which is accessible. But in the winter, you might have 3 layers and then a jacket. For the most part, people are only wearing 1 layer on their leg. And you never want to be pulling down clothes or cutting layers unless you're a paramedic.
So there is and has been a lot of concern in the past about the kind of ramifications that could happen if you were to intervene when somebody is overdosing. So the Good Samaritan Act will cover you if you are helping somebody who's overdosed, which means that regardless of what happens, if the person still overdoses, or even if they preferred to not have been revived, you are covered, which doesn't always or isn't always the case with first aid. So you are covered in that way, at least medically. And then there is always the concern about what might happen to somebody who's maybe on parole or probation if they have overdosed, or if they're there to help revive somebody who's overdosed, and how that might affect them. So one big change is that for the most part, police are not responding to overdoses anymore, which is very comforting to clients of mine, that they don't have to deal with the police presence there.
And there's actually something I'm really excited about. There's a bill going through the Senate, I think it's the Senate right now, that was proposed by a Liberal MP, so that anybody who was in this situation, who was helping with naloxone or who was being given naloxone, it wouldn't be, they wouldn't get in trouble with parole or probation, because that's been a problem in the past. You're saving somebody's life and then it's a breach of your probation, and that sucks. So that's something that they're going through right now, which I'm really excited about, and a lot of my clients are really excited about. So that's sort of naloxone. They're easy to break containers. In the States, they actually will give you about 4 shots worth, and you have to measure it yourself, and we think that's too hard, so you just have the shot here. You sort of make sure that it's all in the bottom, and then you snap it. I won't snap it for you because I didn't bring my regular one, and this is actually naloxone and I don't want to waste it, but it's easy to snap. These are really great syringes. Right here is a spring, so it's a vantage point syringe, which means that after you've finished giving it, you just click one more time, and this needle is actually going to vanish back into the barrel, which means it's safe disposal, because people aren't always thinking about that when they're saving somebody's life. So it's a great kit. One of the things that we've learned is that people aren't breathing enough, obviously, like I explained, when people have gone down. They're not breathing enough, and so we've given out these really great masks. And so you need to be breathing for a person who's gone down once every 5 seconds. The masks are really great because it has all of the instructions on it. It's a one-way valve, so if they choke or vomit or anything like that, it's not going to be a problem for you. You're breathing for them so that they don't have brain damage, which is happening a lot with fentanyl overdoses. But one really great added benefit, and I cannot stress this enough, is that you're also breathing for yourself. And there's so much adrenaline happening when you're doing this for somebody that you really need to be breathing for yourself. When I'm doing these trainings for people, they're panicking and their hands are shaking, even as they're pretending that this is something that they're doing. So if you're breathing for yourself and for somebody else, you're going to calm down. Your body just has to, which is a really great thing. So you're actually going to start on this first. So there's actually in here, this is my favorite thing of this kit, it gives you all of your instructions. Okay? So right here it says stimulate. If you see somebody who's down on the ground, don't assume that they've overdosed. They're not going to be happy with you if you stick them with a needle. I promise you that. So you want to make sure that they're actually down. So a lot of people like the idea of slapping them. That's not my favorite idea. Yell for them, ask them if they're okay, maybe shake them. The best thing, especially if they're not moving, is to take the 3 knuckles and rub it along their sternum. I've accidentally done it too hard on myself and given myself bruises. If that's not waking them up, it's a pretty good indication, okay? Checking their airway. So not just yanking their head back, it's tilt, okay? So bringing their chin forward and tilting it back, making sure that they haven't choked on something. So if there's something in their mouth, maybe that has happened, or maybe they've dropped something in their mouth and they're gonna choke anyways, and you're gonna start breathing for them, and you're gonna check. So start breathing for them first as you're doing this, and then you're going to start getting ready for this. Hopefully in this time you have time to call 911, but if you don't, call 911 after you've given the first shot, as long as you call 911. A lot of people are like, ooh, I don't want to call 911. Please, please, please call 911. Especially with fentanyl and carfentanil, you cannot handle an overdose by yourself. I can promise you that. A lot of people, something to explain is that naloxone yanks the opiate right out of the receptor. So you're taking away their high. And I've talked to people who say they would rather have died than to have felt that, right? It doesn't make sense to us, to me, but in the same time, like it kind of does. They would rather have died in that moment than to have woken up and felt that sick and that horrible. So their instinct is actually to go and use again so they can feel better, but they've still got all of that stuff in there waiting to overdose. This doesn't take away the opiate, it's still hanging out in their system, and they're still gonna return to an overdose. So you cannot leave them, you need to call 911.
I was wondering why we're having this fentanyl crisis. What's the cause? What's the underlying reason for it?
I think that's a very good question. I think, for one thing, we have a lot of people who are, that's a multi-pronged question. We have a lot of people who do not have enough money to survive on, and we have a system that does not help them. So we have a lot of people who are completely without housing, who do not have enough money for food, who do not have enough money for shelter, who don't have enough money to take care of their basic needs. And with that comes a lot of hopelessness. In Nanaimo, to give you an example, we have a lot of people who are homeless, who are sometimes 10 people to an apartment on a cold night sleeping on the floor. We don't have enough renting space in Nanaimo. And we have a lot of people who won't rent to clients. So we have a lot of hopelessness. And so to deal with what they're feeling, they use. But there's also not enough services that necessarily address what they're feeling. So we have methadone programs, and we have, I don't want to criticize programs. There's not enough funding. There's not enough money being spent. And people feel hopeless. BC is really bad for hopelessness.
I've also had about 3 people now talking about relatives, family members who've either died or had near-death experience from fentanyl. So we're starting to see it even here. Another thing is we're also seeing it with middle-class kids, like kids that that aren't maybe living on the street or that kind of thing. So I'm wondering if you see that also in your work.
Absolutely. One of the scariest statistics is that 60% of overdoses in 2016 happened in private residences. So not in motels, not on the street. It was private residences. The people who are most likely to overdose are people who are quote unquote relapsing, people who have not used in a while. Another scary sort of fact is that one of the most popular drugs of choice right now in high schools are fentanyl pills. It's a very, very, very dangerous time for people to be experimenting, and yet it seems to be something that's happening. But for anybody who hasn't used in a while, or for anybody who uses sort of recreationally, it's very dangerous. And there's a lot of shame around using. So anybody who uses by themselves is at an increased risk, which is why you have people who are in that demographic, right? So clients of mine who are getting very, very streetwise. They don't use by themselves, they use with another person, and they stagger their use. So nobody's using together at the same time. They're all waiting about 20 minutes, so if somebody goes down, they can handle it. But if you have somebody who's ashamed of their use or who's going through a hard time and uses for the first time in a while, they are absolutely at a huge risk. And those are the same people who might be afraid to come in and say, get an naloxone kit from us.
Where does it come from all of a sudden? What is it?
Yeah, so fentanyl, you have pharmaceutical grade fentanyl, which is a small portion of the problem, but is part of the problem. Fentanyl is a painkiller. So for example, we have fentanyl patches and fentanyl pills. So you can use a 72-hour fentanyl patch if you have chronic pain or post-surgery, for example. They also will give them to pets. So if you have a pet who is in a lot of pain, or they'll give you a small fentanyl patch, and it lasts about 72 hours. That fentanyl also has the same distributing problem in that it doesn't distribute evenly across the patch. So if you cut it into, say, 9 pieces, the 9 pieces aren't going to have the same amount. And after the 72 hours, there's still quite a bit of fentanyl in it. It's just not actually going to necessarily go through the skin in the same way. So that's been a problem. They actually had to start looking at making people return their patches before giving out new ones. But what we're really looking at is illegal fentanyl. So fentanyl that's being made in China, a little bit in Mexico. So the patent and ingredient list sort of fentanyl went online, ended up in labs in China, and is being created over there, and is now being shipped here for a small cost and is being sold over here. So one thing that we're finding is that fentanyl is actually, people who are being caught with fentanyl are getting pretty harsh prison sentences because of the deaths, which is something that with other drugs and with other substances had started to sort of go down. But with fentanyl, if you get caught with fentanyl, especially with enough fentanyl, and if it's clear that you were planning on trafficking, it's pretty harsh sentences. And so they are really taking this threat seriously, and it seems to be mostly coming in through the ports here.
How do you know that you're getting fentanyl? Is it a pill or is it a powder, or like?
Generally, fentanyl is being found in powder form, so it's finding its way into other things. So it's finding its way into different forms of pills. It's being found in pot, which obviously it's not in its powder form. So whether they're spraying the leaves with fentanyl or crushing it into the plants, that's something I'm not entirely sure of.
I'm just wondering if this is all over the world as well as here. Is it as bad all over the world? Different
places have different opiates. So fentanyl is very much a BC problem right now. There are different parts of the world that have very different problems. I can't remember the name of it now, but there is in there's this huge portion of the world, and I'm completely blanking on it now that I've been put on the spot, and it's completely affected by this other opiate that I had never heard of, and then I started doing my research and I was astounded, right? Because we're so focused on like what's going on here, but our fentanyl crisis is in no way anywhere near as bad as what's going on over there, because it's not Australia, it's some part of Asia, and the opiate there is used so heavily that it's actually into the soil and it's into the food, and everybody is so addicted to it, and even the animals have it, and it's horrible. And ours doesn't even compare to them, which is horrifying.
That's terrible when you think of the numbers we're losing to fentanyl.
It's literally in their plants and in their animals. It's in their soil because everybody uses it, and it's this horrible cycle, and I can't remember what it's called now, but I had never heard of it when I was doing some research on fentanyl a few months back. So every different place seems to have a different thing, but BC is definitely really centered on the fentanyl crisis, and it is the worst sort of, for Canada right now, we have fentanyl, and that's really our problem. But different provinces definitely have different issues.
My concern is this being found in the so-called party drugs, the ones that the kids are think they're being fairly safe when they're experimenting with?
Yeah, we're finding it in pretty much everything. And back to what I was saying earlier, a lot of high schoolers have admitted that their drug of choice is fentanyl pills, which I think when they say that, they're talking about like pharmaceutical, not that that makes me feel necessarily better, but
Stuff they got from medicine cabinets, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. But it is showing up in ecstasy, and it really depends. It's a sort of unknown right now, but.
How is AIDS Vancouver Island working with, or other agencies working with a local school district to bring awareness to them?
That's a great question. So Claire, who does our bigger group trainings, she actually just went into a high school in, I think it was Duncan, and she just did her first naloxone training there, which is really cool. They haven't really allowed that before. She does a lot of the different trainings for us around the central Vancouver Island and a little bit north and south. And she just did a naloxone training there. And whether or not the parents are sort of comfortable with that, she did the whole training and was explaining to them, and we're hoping to sort of expand on that into other high schools. And then we think that's really, really important. And one thing is that a lot of support workers are bringing younger youth in, right? We have a lot of street youth that aren't necessarily seen in the right capacity all the time. And they're actually coming in now and getting their training. But there is a lot that could still be done, right? Like we need to be doing our best to reach everybody possible, and we're really hoping that Claire is able to continue going into high schools and talking with them and expanding on sort of the relationships we already have there.
Thank you again, Michelle. We'd like to thank Michelle for all of her time and for her excellent presentation. If you have more questions about the fentanyl crisis, the opioid issue here in Nanaimo, please contact AIDS Vancouver Island.